So I'm going to introduce the president and CEO of the Big Shoulders Fund, and I can tell you all these fabulous things that they wrote out here, but to show you how smart he is, he has his father with him here today. Bill Hale, thank you very much. Give him a round of applause. Josh, come on up. Ladies and gentlemen, Josh Hale. He's going to run the show today. If you got questions, just get him up here. Give him a round of applause. Josh Hale. Josh? All right, have fun.
I think people just got ready to run for the door when Jay said, Josh Hale's running the show today. So lock the doors, hold everybody tight here. Nobody can get away quite yet. Thank you, Jay, for that warm welcome and for recognizing so many people. And, given the topic we're here today about philanthropy, it's exciting to see so many people. And with someone like Sister Rosemary in the room, really, it's embarrassing to be sitting up here talking about philanthropy for all you've done for our great city. And also, yes. And there's some other giants, whether it's the McCormick Foundation, Terry and the CC, Chicago Community Trust, and the Polk Brothers Foundation, Northern Trust, Commonwealth, that's all these giants of philanthropy. So please be generous in your participation, in your questions, and because we know the great work that so many of you guys do, and you speak about right here from this podium. Given this, I also want to thank the people who really made this possible before we get going. Tweed Thornton, where are you, Tweed, who runs the City Club and really has been arms. Thank you, Tweed. And the guy who had the brainchild for this was Tom Lankto and got Jay to agree to do this. So thank you for allowing us to have this panel today. So as I thought about this topic, philanthropy and the bravery and ensuring a stronger future for Chicago, and really kind of contemplating this, and thinking about panels and some of the big discussions they've had here at the City Club, I went and I started reading some of the recent headlines to kind of get focused on the topic of philanthropy, and really to kind of think through how we should position this and present this. And so as I started looking at some of the headlines of the City Club, I said, let me just kind of get around some of the big topics they tackle. And I looked at some of the headlines and I said, madness on the prairie, the Illinois state budget, gone wild. The Illinois pension disaster, what went wrong? Fiscal cliff, what's next for City of Chicago finances and beyond? You can almost say they're Oregon. And I thought, my goodness, what's going to get us out of bed the next day and to keep going on? As I started to think about it, it's the hope. It's the hope that philanthropy and all of us collective put together to take on these big challenges that are presented here at this forum and so many other forums. How do we use philanthropy as a tool? How do we continue to be brave in the face of so many of these challenges? But before we get started, I thought it'd be good to just give a little context and kind of do a little activity. I work in education, so I thought we should get everybody involved a little bit. At each table, we have someone who has a golden ticket. Does everybody have a golden ticket? You ready? Okay, please stand up. Those are the golden ticket. You can sing the song if you want to, but okay, the rest of you, nonprofits and charities, all of you are nonprofits and charities, these are your philanthropists. These are your new best friends. Okay, so philanthropists, wave. Now, at each table, philanthropists, you have some friends, some new ones who are unbelievably mission-driven and great people, and you also have some old friends. You have some family friends, and they represent theaters, they represent shelters, they represent museums, they represent schools, unbelievable causes. And each one of them is your new best friend. And so, some may think, well, this is pretty easy, right? You get a golden ticket, and each one of these philanthropists has $1 million to give away. But philanthropists, I ask you, how are you going to make a decision? Kathy, Paula, how are you going to make a decision on who to give the funds to? Do you give it to the cause that you really love that person who's running it? Or do you give it to the one where your mother's on the board of? Or do you do the one where, hey, this one makes a huge impact? Or is it you give a little bit to each one? Big decisions. I won't put you on the spot and ask those, but thank you, philanthropists, for your help. And now I introduce you all your friends, and after lunch, maybe you might want to talk about where they're going to give their funds. Especially the real philanthropists. Well, let's get to know those guys especially well. But I thought Aristotle stated it best way back when. He said, to give away money is an easy matter in any woman or man's power. But to decide to whom to give it and how large and when and for what purpose and how is neither every woman or man's power nor easy. And I think that that's really important to think about, that it's not easy to give away money. In fact, it's gotten more complex and even more challenging when we think about how we work together and how we make a collective difference and take on the challenges that we face as a city and a region. And often with the news that we watch every night or read about in the papers, it becomes even more daunting. And I think the part about I like with the bravery is that it takes a certain amount of bravery to step into the world of philanthropy and say, I want to be part of the change. I want to be part of making a difference. And so that philanthropy is somewhat difficult. And so just getting into philanthropy is half the battle. Once you're in, I think you'll stick around. And I'm lucky to work at Big Shoulders Fund with some of the greatest philanthropists, I think, in the city. And one of them, Jay mentioned, Jim, when I think about the history of philanthropy in the city, from our founding fathers, this city has been one of the most generous and a leader in philanthropy. And so we stand on the shoulders of giants in terms of philanthropy. And I think about persons that represent that quality. Jim O'Connor in the city of Chicago for years has represented one of the greatest civic leaders that I know. And so I've learned a lot from him. So please congratulate again, Jim O'Connor. A lot of my lessons come from Jim and others and watching how they interact. And I think you'll hear from our panel some other experts. But Chicago's always been a leader in this. And one of the quotes I took from is the other co-chair of Big Shoulders Fund is John Canning, who many of you know is a philanthropist in the city. And when he first said it, when he talked about philanthropy, someone asked him, so what's your strategy in philanthropy? And he said, really, it's a selfish act. It's a selfish act where I get more out of it than I give. And at first I thought, well, what does that mean? But he said, well, if it's not a little bit selfish, why will you continue to do it? And I think we all need to be a little bit selfish when we think about philanthropy. Because if we don't get something out of it, friendships, participation, otherwise it won't continue. I think there's a couple other sentiments I want to as you think about context. It is more blessed to give than to receive. As I give, I get. I have found that among its other benefits, giving liberates the soul of the giver. I want to share, and I'm stealing a little bit from the Chicago Community Trust, some numbers from a recent study. Again, just in terms of thinking about Chicago before we hear our panelists, that the Chicago Community Trust commissioned a study that was done by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. And it was really remarkable to look at Chicago in the context of the country. And it really was eye-opening. And eye-opening that it confirmed what a lot of us knew. And a couple of numbers, just as we get into a discussion. In 2013 alone, Chicago households, grant makers, and corporations gave $10 billion to make the world a better place here in Chicago. $10 billion, just for context. That is larger than the GDP of 56 countries. It's more than the city of Chicago's budget. That was a shocker. And it's also triple, we always hear, well, Gates Foundation, triple what the Gates Foundation gives away annually. So on top of this incredible amount, the report also says that Chicagoans are generous more than their contemporaries across the country, not only in what they give, but being actively involved. And that's a big deal. So again, when we listen to these panelists and think about philanthropy, I think that's important. And so our hope as the panelists, when we put this together and talked about it, Deborah, Lindsay, and Jim and I, our hope was really that we would walk away from this saying, to understand a little bit more what's happening in philanthropy in the city, what are some of the challenges and opportunities, and how can each one of us walk away from here and say we can do something to work better together or to make a bigger impact. And that's what our real hope is. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to come up. And as they're walking up, I'm going to tell you a little bit about each one of them and then ask them to introduce themselves further. So come on up, guys. Let me start while they're walking up. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about each one of them, short background. I'm sure many of you know them. But Lindsay Avner, who I have just met recently, is an amazing story. She's a founder and CEO at Bright Pink, which is focused on prevention and early detection of breast and ovarian cancer in young women. And from a deeply impactful and personal experience, which she's going to share a little bit about, she transformed from a 23-year-old recent college graduate working in Chicago, just like so many other young people, into this CEO and founder of this national organization that we are going to hear more and more about in the coming years, and the impact and difference she is making. You will get a sense, I assure you, from her passion and her energy and see why she's been so successful in building this organization, from one individual to a national influence. Next to the panel is Deborah Liverett, who many in this new room know. But after her early career working in HR, which she'll talk a little bit about, she got, through a personal experience and through a friend, got pulled into Northern Trust and also to take on a leadership role in shaping the strategy for the bank's Northern Trust Philanthropy around the world, but most importantly, right here in Chicago. She is Senior VP and Director of Community Affairs at Northern Trust, but even more, she is a philanthropic giant, and I think you'll get a sense why, and many of you already know. And finally, Jim Parsons. Now, I first met Jim when he was a lawyer. Okay, so he was in a whole different life. And he was, quite frankly, he's a very, very successful lawyer. Tom Langton worked in the same firm, and Jim became the managing partner in a law firm and was high-flying, and then he had a conversion of sorts. He had a conversion to working in the philanthropic field. Now, I've talked to his daughters since then, and they report that he is actually experiencing reverse aging and that he's more fun than he's ever been. So I don't know. Any lawyers want to make a transition? Bankers, come to Philanthropy. We're ready for you. So, but Jim has actually come into the field with a lot of energy, a lot of smarts, and a lot of leadership. He's done some unbelievably important work, not only here, but nationally in terms of shaping the laws and the rules around philanthropy and how we all interact together. And I think you'll get a sense from his insights of some of the wisdom and also the great philanthropic work he does at the Brinson Foundation. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each one of them now just to give a 2 to 3 minute introduction of themselves and how they got into philanthropy, what kind of inspired that, and what kind of continues to excite them. So Deborah, would you mind kicking us off here?
Happy to. I didn't know I was a giant. 'Cause most people say I'm very small, so thank you for that. It's review time. I will share that at the end.
I'm available to come in to help. Deborah, whatever I can do to help, whatever I can do to help.
Down. Thank you. So you're right. I started in human resources 102 years ago. And it was always important to me to give back and help people. And so in human resources, you're helping people to find the job that's right for them and right for the company. So making that connection was very important. And then a friend of mine said, you know, you do that well, but you have to give back even more. And so I started giving speeches to not-for-profits, and next thing I know, I started being asked to be on committees and boards and that kind of thing. And then another friend said, well, what would you like to do with your life? And I said, well, if money is no object, I'd like to run a charity. But if money is an object, because I'm single, it was an object, I said, I would like to give away a corporation's money. And be careful what you ask for, because it got created that I could do that at Northern.
Jim, do you want to jump in next?
Sure, and I'd like to start out with a few remarks about the Brinson Foundation. We're a family foundation. 2 of my 3 staff members are here today, and our job is to research and recommend grant opportunities to our board. We have 2 focus areas, 2 priorities. One is education, the other scientific research. In education, we have 7 focus areas. They are STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, literacy, financial literacy, high school, college, career success, liberty, citizenship, and free enterprise, student health, and healthcare career development. On the scientific research side, we have 2 areas, medical research and research in the physical sciences. The areas in there are astrophysics, don't ask me too many questions about it, cosmology, which I actually had to go to the dictionary to find out what it was before I went to the foundation, geophysics, and finally evolutionary developmental biology, which I've found that you cannot say at a cocktail party after 2 glasses of wine. So in any event, I am, as Josh mentioned, a recovering lawyer, which is quite a difficult process. I spent 26 years at a firm called Gardner, Carter & Douglas, as Josh mentioned. Tom and I were partners there. I spent the last 13 years as the managing partner. And when I finished my tour of duty, I was really ready to do something different. And I'd had a lot of experience in the nonprofit sector with board service and with volunteer activities, which, frankly, looking back on it, was probably some of the most valuable things I've ever done because it got me interested in the nonprofit sector. I ended up at the foundation kind of just because I was in the right place at the right time. I happened to meet somebody who knew Gary Brinson. I'd done some work for his company. I did not know him, but somebody opened up the door. I went and met him, and we hit it off. He wasn't looking for an established philanthropist necessarily, but I think my prior service in the nonprofit sector really meant something because I had a little perspective about what that was all about. It won't surprise you probably that managing grant making is a slightly more fulfilling job than managing profits per partner. I mean, who wouldn't like helping nonprofits do good for the city and our residents? It's really been a terrific transition for me. I've learned a lot, and a much better person for it. I actually am 75 years old. I just look really young. No, no.
Lindsay, can you give us your insights and a little background?
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much for including me. My story actually started back before I was even born. 11 women on my mom's side of the family had died of either breast or ovarian cancer before I was born. My mom is a 22-year breast, 21-year ovarian cancer survivor, which is pretty amazing. And when I was 22, which is over a decade ago, I had the opportunity that generations of women before me never had, which is I had the chance to actually know my risk for developing breast and ovarian cancer. I tested positive for the BRCA1 gene mutation, the one that Angelina Jolie recently made so common and familiar within pop culture. But what that whole opportunity of just understanding what my risk was, having the opportunity to elect for a risk-reducing double mastectomy, the age of 23 at the time, I was the youngest person in the country ever to decide that, really enabled me to realize that there was this whole focus in our country around treating diseases and treating problems, right? The moment someone gets sick, all of a sudden, all this action kicks in, and yet there are 52 million women in the US between 18 and 45 that don't have cancer, breast or ovarian cancer, and can do something about it. And so I started Bright Pink 7 years ago, based just a couple blocks from here, but we're a national organization. Our programs will reach more than 14 million women in 90 communities around the country. And the whole idea is, thank you, which it is great. But the whole idea is, how do we reach women and inspire them to not just be aware of breast and ovarian cancer, right? Awareness is enough, but actually take action, because action is what saves lives.
It's an unbelievable story. I also just want to point out that am I right, you had just kind of arrived in Chicago as a college student, working for a PR firm, and then started this firm on your own, this group on your own, and now it's gone national.
Yeah, at Unilever in marketing. But
Unilever,
absolutely.
yes. I couldn't believe that.
And it became a labor of love, which is, how can I not go through an experience like this and feel this immense responsibility to serve and to make it different for other women.
It's very tough for my father to hear this, because at 23, I was not doing quite the productive things that you were. So look what's happened, though. It's slowly working its way through. Lindsay, this is not very easy for me. So there's a lot going on in philanthropy, and you guys all come at it from large family foundation, corporate sector, is an individual that started something, but each one of them, you're working in concert with lots of different groups and watching the landscape. When you think about that landscape, which is significant, but specifically in Chicago, what do you see as one of the most exciting things happening in philanthropy? Is it peer-to-peer? Is it impact giving? What do you see that's very exciting? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I'll start, and you may not find this particularly exciting. This probably goes back to my operational days at the law firm, but it's about numbers. And one of the trends that's happening in the city today, and I think we're taking a lead nationally on this, is that funders are really focusing more on covering nonprofit overhead costs. When I joined the foundation in 2004, I heard an awful lot about how important it was to look at the ratio of management, general, and fundraising expenses to total costs. And it's an easy thing to do. If you look at the IRS Form 990 that all nonprofits have to file, it's broken out, the program expenses and everything else. And everybody looks at that ratio. And all the charity watchdogs out there, and they still do, they focus on this. It's one of the ways that they grade nonprofits. And I know in a lot of boardrooms that you'll hear this, let's keep the costs down. And I think the unfortunate thing about that is it's not really necessarily the right folks. And thankfully, back in 2009, a group from the Bridgespan group did an article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called The Nonprofit Starvation Cycle. And it focused on the fact that funders were spending way too much time focusing on these expense ratios, and nonprofits weren't very good at articulating the importance of the expenses that allowed them to run the place. That article started a dialogue, and it's continued today. And now we're learning that expense ratios are a really poor indicator of nonprofit performance. That's just not the place you ought to be looking. There are a lot of reasons why expenses can be higher in one organization than the next, and that discussion has translated into practice. I got to give credit to the Chicago Community Trust. They recently announced at their anniversary luncheon that they are going to be focusing on giving more general operating support, which is a terrific move. A lot of other local funders, when they're funding programs, and there are reasons to fund that, is we're trying to make sure that we're funding some of those indirect costs, not just the direct program costs. And this is really a big development. Forefront, some of you may know, formerly the Donors Forum has a big strategic initiative on this, and a lot of attention is going to be paid to it, and I think Chicago's in the lead on that. It's very exciting.
And I'll make a plug for Northern Trust. We have always done operating, and we're not going to stop, so.
It's wonderful. Go ahead.
Okay. So the thing that I'm seeing that excites me the most is collaboration. When about 10 years ago was the first time I started hearing about it, and it was a slow move. And in fact, Northern Trust and probably 7 or 8 other corporations decided to band together some money to help the arts. And we look at small arts organizations. It's called Artworks Fund. We look at small, under $1 million, and help them with capacity building. Now, when I look at all of the collaboration and how important it is, because we need to lock arms to help each other. We can't do it individually. The numbers are too big, the numbers of people in need and the numbers of dollars that are needed. So we have collaborations like Ingenuity. We're working with Ingenuity on bringing the arts back into education. That's important, and I think we're on that together, right, Jim? And then we have Forefront is working with not-for-profits and looking at mergers and acquisitions, and we're trying to figure out how can we fund that and help them so that they can collaborate. Not-for-profits, on the flip side, they're working together and saying, okay, let's pull all of our backroom operations together so that we can save money on the accounting fees, on the healthcare fees, those kinds of things. So I think collaboration is the way that we're going to become much more successful.
I think that's great. And Jim, I would actually take the alternative side from a nonprofit perspective as it relates to numbers. I think I am just so inspired by the emphasis on metrics and making sure as a nonprofit we're being really good stewards of the funds that are being entrusted in us. At our organization, we operate everything off of a balanced scorecard. So my team all knows their KPIs. They know what initiatives are driving it. And we're holding ourselves really accountable, where in the past it may have just been okay to say, we distribute educational material, we hopefully saved a life. Like, we're very intentional about knowing 3-6 months after people leave an educational workshop, did they actually change their health behavior? Did they go to the doctor? Did they do something different? And so I think it's this culmination around expectations being set. So to Jim's point, allowing nonprofits to have the resources. When people ask me a similar question, when they say, are you paying your people too much? I always say, you should be afraid I'm not paying them enough. Like, we need really smart people solving these problems. And it's one of those things, though, when you have smart people and you have funders that are partners, you also have the ability to hold each other accountable and mutually report out those results, which is super important.
That's a great insight. Let me just on that. See if I can ask this question. But so there's a discussion about general operating support or focus giving, and you have someone like McCormick Foundation said early childhood. We are all in on this. We have experts. We're going to build on this. General Op, which is an incredible need, the CCT, Community Trust, or Polk Brothers saying, we're going to help those front, Northern Trust. How do you start to think about that versus, almost stamina giving, where we're going to remain like uber focused on this topic? We're going to address this issue. How do philanthropists think about it? How do you, work with other foundations or other groups, or how would you encourage, people that work in the space to think about that?
So I'll start. We have a finite amount of money, and so we have to have guidelines that make sense. And because Northern Trust is a global organization, we want to make sure that what we're looking at fits globally. So that education around the world is critical for anyone to pull themselves up. We know that women are the disadvantaged group, the largest disadvantaged group around the world, so we focus on women as well. So women, their children, by educating them, and then people who are living with disabilities. We know that population, again, globally suffers. So we want to make sure that we're helping them to get workforce development, affordable housing, good education opportunities for their children, so that we can push this idea of we can build ourselves up, we can do better.
So in some ways, there's focus, but maybe you're giving to general op, or maybe you're giving to specific, or maybe helping organizations develop best practices and to share them. And I think that, that's one of the things we've talked in the past is one of the best practices is this sharing of, are there other things that you're seeing in the space where you'd say, this is the new best practice. This is where things are moving. You talked about collaboration. What are other examples you see where organizations are better, or you're helping nonprofits to share best practices across the space, or to say, you should think about merging, you should think about partnerships,
Right.
which probably isn't something we're all comfortable about sitting on the other side of the table, but how do you start to look at the space?
So one of the things we try to do is educate board members. Before we send a Northern Trust person out to be a board member, I meet with them. We talk through what's the way to handle yourself on a board. We're educating them. We have classes on governance, on fundraising. We have a class coming up next year on strategic planning, so that they are fully prepared when they're on the board to ask the right questions for exactly that reason. Should you be looking as a board member and saying, is there someone else that's doing this better than we are?
Right.
And should we be partnering with them? And how should we partner with them? Those are questions that people didn't traditionally ask, but we have to make them better and better.
I would jump. Oh, I'm sorry.
go
Jim,
ahead.
go ahead. I was gonna just jump in, and I think that's the responsibility of like all of the stakeholders within the organization, is to really ensure that the nonprofit is being super, super laser focused, because I think sometimes this can be very like it just feeds you in a way where you're like, and I want to do more, and I want to do more, and I want to do more. But the truth is that if you're not staying focused and you're not tackling a problem really deeply, really intentionally, and through the full spectrum, you're not going to be successful. So.
One thing that we've found at the Brinson Foundation, and this goes back to 2009 or so, when funds were shrinking, everybody was really struggling at that point in time. And one of the things we were saying is that a lot of nonprofits didn't have the funds to do the capacity building that they needed to. They weren't able to send their staff to the important conferences. They weren't able to hire the consultants to do some of the technical work that they needed. And we started a professional development technical assistance program. And we offered it to all of our grantees. We were really surprised. It wasn't just the little guys. It was the big guys. And even if you're providing general operating support, those funds are going to cover the basic programs and keeping the doors open. There aren't necessarily the dollars available to send people to those conferences, to do all that necessary work. And I think that's something that's really important for all of us to think about as funders, to make sure that the grantees you're working with have the capacity to do their work as well as they can.
A great insight. So just, I noticed just a moment ago, Jim O'Connor, Cheryl and Lester and Tom, a few of the board members at Big Shoulders taking notes. I think there's a report card forming here about what I'm not doing. So you guys could kind of simmer down a little bit. That's not good too. Maybe throw out a couple platitudes about Josh Hale, something, he's doing great. We really like him. Anything like that would help, just a little. Trying to stay gainfully employed here through the holidays.
I'll talk to Tom afterwards.
I'll write it down for you. That's good.
Okay, how many people have at one point said that next generation, they're not quite doing it the right way? Has anybody ever mumbled those words? Oh, the next generation, those millennials, right? What's happening in philanthropy in terms of the next generation? However you might describe it, whether it's millennials or the generation behind you, how are different groups starting to change the way that they interact with or practice their philanthropy?
Well, I'm actually going to do something really stupid and start off on this since I'm not part of that next generation. It's terrible to generalize, and I actually have two daughters here today who will rake me over the coals for my remarks because I really don't know what I'm talking about. But I'll give you my sense and kind of what I've read. And I think that my generation and the generations that came before me were really focused much more on organizational reputation, visibility. It's the people we knew. It was the neighborhoods they served, whether it was the places we worked or the places we lived. And today's young people have access to a lot more information through the social media, and there's an enormous information available about the innovative programs around the country and around the world that's available through a few keystrokes. And I think that that's opened up their giving, and they're thinking about giving so that they aren't just thinking about the local community quite as much and thinking about all the great programs around. So I think it's a much more flexible, much more nationally, globally focused sort of philanthropy, which is a good thing.
I think what's been so inspiring is seeing the fact that a young person can be surrounded by this in every part of their life. It's not as though they, work for 30 years, do their career, and then they think about legacy and service. It's actually starting in their high schools, it's starting in their colleges. Something that has been just incredibly exciting, in my opinion, has been the idea that you have a place to put and find this meaning in your life early on. So we'll see tons. We just saw a cross-country team up in the northern suburbs where they did an 800-mile run, and they each raised, $40, and then together they raised more than $12,000 in one day. And you're seeing people bind together. It's becoming an element of community. It's becoming an element of social status, right? To put that thing on your Facebook page, I support this, I care about this. And it's actually feeds on each other. So you're watching it infiltrate groups of friends, influencers, spread the word. And I think that is just such an amazing, amazing way for this next generation to be growing up, which is in the spirit of philanthropy.
And I'll add to that from the corporate side, what we're seeing is new hires, especially those right out of college, will say to us, we chose Northern Trust because you give 2 days off for people to go out and volunteer. We chose Northern Trust because you understand and had always understood since 1889 that volunteerism is important. So we make that a critical mass for our employees.
Are there any challenges? One of the things you talked about was more information, global. So, someone maybe think about being a philanthropist here and then saying, let's raise money for water and wherever, which is great. But what does that mean for Chicago philanthropy? How do, whether it's as a foundation or as an individual, what is the responsibility here versus someplace else or both? Or how would you guide someone?
So for us, because Chicago is headquarters, a lot of our philanthropy dollars are still here in Chicago, and that won't change. Our CEO is very committed to this city, as we all are. From a global standpoint, you have to help them understand what's important overall, and then help them find the money within their own budget most of the time, with a little help from corporate, but most of the time their own budget as well.
I think part of what we've done is use Chicago in our backyard as our testing place, right? So our medical professional program, we piloted at Northwestern for 3 years before rolling it out to 90 of the top academic institutions in the country this past year. And I think because this community, this city has philanthropy so in its DNA, it's willing to allow you to pivot, to change, to make some mistakes once in a while, and to be with you for the long haul so that you can actually work it out here to then affect change for us all around the country. So that's been a really exciting, it's an exciting place to be situated in order to affect change in a greater way.
So Lindsay, obviously you do work here, but also nationally.
Yeah.
The bank is a global, and Brinson, you do work all over. Is there a benefit to being in Chicago? What is it about the culture here? What is it about being from Chicago, being part of the nonprofit, the philanthropy here in Chicago? That is it part of the culture? What is it? What makes Chicago so unique in this way?
I mean, we really have an extraordinary community here. We have great assets. We have incredible cooperation. I think I would have to say that knowing philanthropists from some other cities, they are really envious of us because the philanthropic and nonprofit sector, as well as the public sector, works together in these discussions. And even if we think differently, we have different perspectives and disagree about the approaches, we still have productive dialogues, and it results in some really terrific initiatives that other areas of the country look to us to see what we're doing. And I hear this constantly from people who are coming in to see what some of our programs are. I think that another thing is we have some really amazing research institutions, and because we fund a lot in education, I'll mention one of them. It's the U Chicago Consortium. They just announced a change in their name from the Consortium on Chicago School Research. Forefront, the donors, everybody's changing their name. I don't think we're going to change the Brinson Foundation. Gary probably wouldn't like that too much. But they have some of the cutting edge research. It's really unparalleled in terms of telling us about what's going on in public education, and that informs our work. It makes us a lot better. And I can tell you, people around the country are really envious of those resources.
That's very true. I was on a panel about a month ago talking to people from San Diego. Same thing. They wanted to understand, why does Chicago care so much about the underserved, and how can they then translate that in San Diego? So I think there was Exelon, Allstate, Northern Trust. We were all there trying to help them understand that That's what makes us a global city. That's what allows people to want to come to Chicago, because we do so much good in our neighborhoods.
And I would just say, I think it's that combination between the Midwest niceness married with like the accountability and sophistication of an incredible city that allows us to do really great things. It's all rooted in a deep, authentic sense of compassion, which shows.
All right, so it sounds like Camelot here, but I'm going to come visit all your offices for a grant meeting. Well, let me tell you about all my problems.
Yeah.
But so, what do you, when you look at the philanthropic landscape, and whether it's on addressing issues or it's policy, what are some of the challenges? What are the things that you see as the uphill slog right now, or Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill that we say, boy, this is really challenging on the horizon? What's happening out there?
Do you remember those titles of those city club programs you were talking about? I thought we weren't going there.
This all feel good. We're thankful right now this time of year.
I would say from our end, and it's funny, we were just talking about this at our table around this concept that within an organization, there's like one person or one team that's responsible for raising the money. At our organization, we're in the process of actually deconstructing development and putting revenue accountability across the organization. Instead of calling it development, which can be kind of an ugly word, thinking about it as impact enabling, the idea that it's not this dirty thing to go ask for money. It's actually allowing us to have the impact that we want, and all together, we're going out there and seeing the intersection between those two. I think that's still a challenge, though. I would argue we have not figured it out. I think, at our team, we're just talking about the churn of development people and how do you find great people to raise money and all that stuff. And I think the truth is you find really super smart, passionate people, and you give them goals, and you align that revenue accountability across the organization for that security. But again, it's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm. I'd say the challenge is there are so many organizations and so few dollars. That's the real challenge. And everybody's cause is wonderful and helps somebody else, and you want to do that, but you just can't.
Yeah.
That's the challenge. And it seems larger now than it did years ago.
Having that golden ticket's a little bit more complicated, isn't it? Right? Listen, now, one of the toughest things about this job today is that I'm in the shadow of Paul Green, who is the expert moderator in question. He gave me my first tip, questions. If anybody has any questions, please start bringing them forward. We'd love to ask them. I hope they're tough questions, because I don't have to answer any of them. We've got a great panel of smart people. I'm just a facilitator. I'm just here to help the team. So please send questions up so we can, I'm trying to stump them, but they're doing pretty darn good so far. And while those are coming up, just an example, we talked about not to go down the road of, we want to end on a high note here, Jim. So, I read some of those headlines, but where do you see philanthropy working with, whether it's a city or with issues, to really gain traction? Where do you see some of the most hope around philanthropists, whether individuals or corporations or foundations, coming together and saying, hey, we're making traction, and what are we learning from that?
Well, I'll offer a couple of examples, and this is, places where not only philanthropists but also the nonprofits and the public sector are coming together, and two of those is Forefront. They have a number of strategic initiatives that are really critical to our sector, including diversity and philanthropy, promoting individual giving, the Real Cost Initiative I mentioned earlier, as well as streamlining government grants. Thrive Chicago is an extraordinary collective impact initiative that's going on. Some of you may have heard of it. They have 5 change networks that are focusing on ways we can improve outcomes from the cradle to career continuum. So there's some great environments today for people to get together to talk about ways we can improve the city.
And I'd also say social interventions. A lot of people are saying, I want to help people, and so you'll have women who are making products, and then this social entrepreneur will say, all right, we're going to sell them on my website. That didn't happen years ago. So people are able to do more now with this, as Jim mentioned earlier, the social media. That's going to help.
I would also just echo that I think it's when you're starting to see if you're really going to crack change, it requires you thinking totally different. And in doing so, it means sometimes you're going to fail. And I think this concept around funders, stakeholders, donors who are okay sometimes with the organization being honest and coming and saying, you know, we tried this, we invested in this in a pilot phase, we didn't roll it out, and it didn't work, but here's what we learned, and here's the responsibility we have now to share that with other organizations so that they can get those learnings. I think we need to get a little more comfortable with making mistakes and actually breaking through to get the change that we want.
And I'll just on that point, I think that's a really good one. Our founder, Gary Brinson, has said that we should have an element of risk in our portfolio. And I think it's really important to recognize if you're a philanthropist and you don't fail periodically, you're not doing a very good job of being a philanthropist.
Right.
It's a great. So we're going to shoot to some questions from the audience, and they have been listening and paying attention. I hope you guys are on your A game, because these are going to be some tough, but no, actually some really insightful questions here. And I'm going to consolidate 3 of them at first, just to for efficiency. But it's an important topic and one that's front of mind right now. And I'm going to consolidate from Graham Grady, Tracy Frederick, and William Davis. William Davis is from Governor State University, Tracy Frederick from Merrillac St. Vincent Family Services, and Graham Grady, who everybody knows here. And is very active in the philanthropic space and his role on the board of the Fry Foundation. But, you know, his quote was that the question of the day is, what is the philanthropic community doing to prevent the next Tyshawn Lee and Laquan McDonald murders? How are we as a philanthropic community working together? What's happening, and how do we get more focused on stopping the violence in Chicago? And those are the other 3 questions as well. Is there something you guys see in terms of, you know, traction or opportunities, or even advice for all of us, how we can jump in as philanthropists?
Well, I'll take a shot. I mean, that's not the violence situation is not something we focus on directly, but I think that any philanthropist who's working in Chicago communities today, we're trying to do what we can to ensure a brighter future for our youth. And to the extent we're building those communities and providing them with educational opportunities, better health options, and really trying to rebuild those communities, it's just going to take some of that tension away. It's a very complicated issue, and by the way, philanthropy can't solve everything. That's something that the entire community, business, nonprofits, government, and philanthropy has to be involved with. Really complicated.
It is very complicated. We put money towards Get In Chicago, which is trying to look at that situation and talk about, in the beginning, we struggled because you're giving money to organizations that don't have the capacity to do all the things that the children need. So we had to ratchet back and figure out, okay, what is the next step then? And you pick things like getting mentors for children. You make sure that their parents get better parenting techniques, getting them opportunities after school so they're not on the streets during certain times when it's critical. That's critical activity is going on. So it is very complex, but we are trying to lock arms to make a difference.
And obviously, our focus is breast and ovarian health. We're one of the charitable partners for Chicago Bulls Charities, so we work very closely. They have a focus around health and wellness and violence prevention to make sure that we're bringing our programs into those other partner organizations, those communities. I still believe that, you know, education, knowledge, it's the great equalizer and very, very, very empowering for these women in these communities to feel as though someone's talking to them very openly, giving them the tools, the resources to be proactive with their breast and ovarian health.
Those are great insights. It's a tough topic, and thank you for asking. I think it's important that we all continue to think about how we do, as Deborah said, lock arms on this and try to find more ways to work together. Another topic that is always top of mind in terms of nonprofits and how we run most effectively is ensuring diversity in the boardroom from all different perspectives. How do you guys as philanthropists, and what have you seen as best practices? This comes from Jerome Harper, around what's the responsibility of the philanthropy community to really help to continue to keep that top of mind?
So, all right, I'm a corporation, I'll talk about it. So, absolutely, diversity and inclusion, and actually Jerome works with Connie Lindsay, they know this way better than I do. The idea of this world is changing. The number of people in this world, and what the demographics and how it looks is changing. So, for a corporation, you have to make sure that your employees and your board look like the people that are in the world that you're trying to serve. So that's number one for diversity. Number two, we know that if we don't help the least of us out there who are struggling, we're not going to have people to hire. in 20 years. We have to get them on a better road. So we talk diversity and inclusion every day. It is not something that you can push under a rug, not anymore.
And I would just say for us, from a programmatic focus, when you're talking to a certain group of people who have the means and who have the resource and who have great insurance, it's a different conversation, right? But that doesn't mean that it's any less important. So we have to be very intentional about going into communities, into organizations, into churches, into places where people who desperately need this breast and ovarian health information are, and making sure that we're showing up and delivering them in a way. And I don't think it's always one size fits all. And I think we've learned that it's okay to actually have this conversation in a different way if it all ends you to the same goal, which is allowing people to feel informed, to have access to the resources that they need.
All right, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, with the Family Foundation, our board is all family members, so that's not something that, as a staff member, I am in a position to address. But I think it's really important when you're a funder, you have to have the perspective of the community, and you have to have an understanding of what the issues are you're dealing with the street. And to the extent that you don't have diversity, it's much harder. You have to get out there, you have to develop trust, you have to understand the people in the communities you're working with. Otherwise, you're not going to be very good at it. We've not taken the position that it's our role to make decisions with respect to governance of nonprofits. At the same time, if a nonprofit doesn't understand for the same reasons the issues in the communities they're dealing with, because they have some people who come from there, understand it, it's going to be harder for them. And so we recognize the issue.
All right, this is lightning speed, so you have to talk as fast as I do on these ones, all right? So first question is from Glenn Mazaid, West Suburban Bank. Why has the nonprofit sector been so slow to consolidate? Do you see this accelerating in the next 5 years? Are there too many not-for-profits? And what's the role of the philanthropy community in that? Let's not dwell on this too quickly, or too long, I mean, just kidding.
Well, from a funder's perspective, there are an awful lot. I think that, this is really a boardroom issue, and there's a lot. I mean, I can tell you there's a lot of jurisdictional issues. There's a lot of pride in the efforts, and it's really hard to bring them together. There are organizations out there that are promoting, and I'll just use one. The Chicago Literacy Alliance has a Literacy Center that's bringing 60 organizations together where they can part and talk, and I think that's going to lead to a lot of additional collaborations, potentially some mergers. I think it's a good thing for nonprofits to consider, but it's a tough one.
That's great. Lightning speed, any additions to that? Next.
I would just say when I was about 10 years ago, I never had the intention of starting a nonprofit. But the problem is when you go out there and you see all these organizations and no one's focused on this specific topic, you have nothing to do but say, I need to be the one to make this happen. Part of what we've talked about in our future 5-year strategic growth strategy is acquiring organizations potentially, no different than you would be thinking about from a corporate perspective, that have expertise and that have roots that we don't have to bring those additional capabilities in-house.
What a panel. Please give them a huge round of applause.